Hello and welcome to Syria Talks. I'm your host, Danny Mackey. This unique show explores the detailed intricacies of the conflict in Syria. As terrorism begins to extend from the battlefields of the Middle East to the capitals of the Western world, now more than ever, Western policy towards the Levant is under the spotlight. The senseless Charlie Hebdo attack that shocked the West has also reiterated the importance of quelling fundamentalism and extremism, which has emerged so violently in Syria. The attacks drew strong warnings and reflected a large global concern. US Attorney General Eric Holder stated that fear of a lone wolf attack keeps me up at night, adding that the possibility of new terror attacks in America is still present. The impending jihadist threat emanating from Syria is now of paramount importance to world security. Today, we discuss how this topic has taken the focus of Western policy in Syria. Joining us today will be Dr. Dibyesh Anand, Head of the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster. But before we begin, let's take a quick look at this video report on the media and public opinion transformation in regards to Syria.
There has been a significant change in public opinion regarding the Syria conflict. This is reflected in the media, which has taken a more moderate stance towards the Syrian president. For instance, The Guardian discussed how the US changes its tune on Syrian regime change as ISIS threat takes top priority. The paper argued that US backing for Syria peace talks hosted by the Russian government in Moscow this week is being seen as further evidence that the Obama administration has quietly dropped its long-standing demand that President Bashar al-Assad step down as part of any settlement. The US media has also altered its viewpoint, with counterterrorism now a priority in Syria. The New York Times elaborated on the shifting narrative, describing the West's quiet retreat from its demand that the country's president, Bashar al-Assad, step down immediately. According to the newspaper, more are starting to think that Washington now believes that if Mr. Assad is ousted, there will be nothing to check the spreading chaos and extremism. The changing narrative was also augmented by a picture of the Syrian leader in a better light than before, with references to Mr. Assad used for the first time. This alteration in narrative stretches to France as well, where Laurent Fabius, the French foreign minister, stated of the Syrian war that the political solution will of course include some elements of the regime because we don't want to see the pillars of the state fall apart. We would end up with a situation like Iraq. In essence, this reflects a wider change of priorities. Whilst opinion polls also suggest that 76% of the US electorate view defending the US against terrorism as the most important policy priority.
Dr. Dibyesh Anand, welcome to the show. Public opinion has changed considerably on Syria throughout the previous year. Is Western policy in Syria now strictly focused on counterterrorism, or is there still an elemental desire for regime change?
I think when we look at Western policy, and specifically US foreign policy towards the Middle East, we have to keep in mind that there are different competing interests. The main interest of US is to maintain certain kind of instability throughout the region, where the US is the one that balances power. So you'd have struggles between Iran and Saudi Arabia and other countries where US becomes an important actor. That is a key factor. Second is stability of oil. Third also is the security of Israel. Now these are bigger paradigm that we need to keep in mind when we try to look at what the Western and US foreign policy towards Syria is. The reason why US wanted regime change in Syria was because Syrian regime was one of the few ones that would still seen as someone that could have threatened Israeli security. Now through civil war in Syria, now they failed to change the regime. At the same time, the fact is they have weakened the regime up to a point where Israel can go and bomb into Syria and no one can do anything about it, right? So from Western perspective, therefore, and one more thing, remember with the chemical weapons deal. So US got what it wanted out of Syria. Now, when we look at the policy today, yes, counterterrorism is important. US is anxious about ISIS and all of the extremist groups, but let's not forget that the same US and same Western countries were the ones that created, or at least created the condition under which these kinds of extremist groups flourish in the first place. So today, for instance, when Western public opinion has changed, the US has not given up on regime change, but for the time being, it would not want the regime to be, let's say, regime to collapse the way it did in Iraq, because that may create bigger problems. But does it imply that they will become pals or friends with Assad? It's unlikely.
It's unlikely. I mean, when you discussed the concept of the chemical weapons deal, this was done in consensus with Russia, in consensus with the UN. So there was an element of coordination between all groups and parties who worked on the deal. However, with the issue of ISIS and the extremist groups now emerging in Syria, I mean, how do the West stop this threat which is now emerging? Is there any clear agendas which they can pursue to stop the influx of jihadists into Syria and to stop the return of these jihadists from Syria?
I think when we look at, again, especially US, France and UK, let's focus on three of them. In last 2 years, they seem to have no problem with their own citizens going into, especially especially UK and France. They had no problems in their own citizens going into Syria and fighting against Assad. They had no problem with that. Now, the challenge for them is that the same people who get very radicalized and then come back to the UK, and then, like we saw in France, they could potentially create problem for their own country. So we have to keep in mind that Western states' main interest is not ending of terrorism, because they themselves use terrorism when it suits their interest. The main interest is to prevent terrorist attacks on their own soils. So in that process, the main focus right now would be to prevent fighters from coming back into their own country. Now the challenge they face is that the chauvinism and extremism and radical ideas that lead to these young men, mostly, sometimes women, but mostly young men, thinking that they're going to become heroes, they're going to become jihadis, and going into Syria and fighting, and in case of ISIS, going and beheading people, especially civilians. I mean, those radical ideas can also take roots in these countries themselves. So therefore, the problem that, let's say, UK or France and other countries faces, how to sort of justify their own support for, I mean, look at very extremist regimes of the kind that are in Saudi Arabia, for instance, how to be friends with them, how to talk about Islamic extremism, right, as being threat to them, at the same time wanting to destabilize the region, where they realize that so long as, I mean, what they would want is their own allies. Take example of Turkey, Qatar, UAE, or even Saudi Arabia. They are seen as instrumental in at least providing through private sources funding to ISIS. So I don't think that the US or UK are actually serious in ending the crisis of ISIS. The main threat is to let ISIS to create havoc in Syria,
this is very
create
well
in Iraq,
documented.
not beyond.
I mean, the Saudi funding for ISIS and other extremist groups in the region is an issue which has taken a lot of media attention. But at the same time, we're discussing today jihadists from France, Britain, Germany, in the thousands. We're discussing people who are born and bred in the West. We're discussing people who are raised in Western schools. They live a Western culture. It is these individuals now who are going to Syria to fight a war which is against the interests of their own home states on a foreign land. I mean, to what extent has Western policy actually aided this jihadist threat and this Pandora's box of jihadism which has emerged?
In fact, I would say that Western policy has been very fundamental in creating the conditions under which such kind of extremism flourished. Let's take example of Middle East. The main movement in Middle East in 1940s, 50s and 60s was of secular nationalists. Because secular nationalists seen as generally closer to the USSR, US and West in general encouraged not only radical extremist regimes of the kind that was in Saudi Arabia, but also they encouraged certain kind of political Islamism. Now, we see for the first time, I mean, properly where people went to fight so-called jihad, I say always so-called because they don't seem to understand the meaning of jihad, it was in Afghanistan. And the West was an ally of the Muslim extremists in this context.
They were called Mujahideen.
They were called Mujahideen, and they were, remember, I mean, there were these movies called Rambo 2, Rambo 3, where they were seen as freedom fighters. The point is, the West seems to like extremism so long as extremists target the enemies of the West. But when the same extremists target the West and Western allies, they start describing them as terrorists. Now, in today's context, they do have a serious crisis in hand. How to deal with chauvinism and extremism, which fuels these guys to go and fight on foreign soils. But at the same time, what you'd find is also US and UK and other countries using these kinds of crises to put more and more citizens under surveillance, and again further Islamophobia. So we are witnessing an era where you'd find both Islamists and Islamophobes coming together in making life of majority of Muslims and non-Muslims very difficult.
I mean, do you perceive that the United States of America today is reliant on a state such as Syria, which is also fighting ISIS, but on the ground rather than the sky? Do you perceive that the US is now reliant on a country which it has sought to topple? Is there an element of thinking that the West were wrong in advocating total regime change in Syria, and that a preservation of state institutions or some sort of solution with the remainder of elements of the state which is currently present is the best option for the West at this current moment in time?
I think from when we look at the policy pronouncements or statements made by leaders, they'll still say that they would want Assad to go, right? At the same time, from relatively junior officials, you'll hear statements which would show that they're fine with Assad being in power so long as he can also fight ISIS. But West, I mean, when you look at Western states, I mean, they are deeply imperialist and arrogant states. So it's unlikely they're going to accept that they were wrong. But I'm sure there would be some kind of thinking going on because they can see the kind of mess they have made in Iraq and the kind of mess they have made in parts of Syria. So when we look at, for instance, what happened in Kobane, in the Syrian Kurdistan, or let's say Western Kurdistan, we do find that the US did aid Kurds. Even Syrian regime was indirectly behind it, but essentially it was Kurds who fought. So what we find in the Middle East is if people fight for their own liberation, for their freedom, US may not like it, but if it suits its interest, it may back it. But vis-a-vis Syria, I mean, I would be surprised if there's a fundamental change in policy, but no doubt there's a rethinking going on that the kind of regime change they went for in Iraq and the kind of regime change they hoped for in Syria is something that's going to or may lead to more and more chaos.
Now, Dr. Anand, what is truly lacking from Obama's ISIS strategy in Syria? Is there one element which really can be brought into the game to make the US policy in fighting terrorism within Syria more efficient and more effective? I mean, Obama planned to arm approximately 5,000 of the moderate rebels inside of Syria. We all know they're not moderate, and we all know they have relations with jihadists. I mean, how can the US adapt their policy in Syria to actually be more efficient and more effective in fighting these dangerous Islamist terror movements which have grown very strong in the region?
I mean, look, in terms of when we look at US policy, Obama's policy, I think the fundamental factor is there needs to be a rethinking of how US cannot be selective in how it promotes terror and extremism depending on what it suits its interest. The fundamental thing that they can do is tackle especially Saudi Arabia, even Turkey and Qatar, in terms of being very firm with them that not only that these states should not be promoting or even talking or being apologists for ISIS and other extremist groups, but they should stop even private funding going from them. I mean, I think it would be naive to believe that if US was really pressurizing Saudi Arabia or Qatar, that they would still allow or continue to allow the transfer of private money from Qataris and Saudis into ISIS hands. I think that's a fundamental change that US can bring about. Whether it will bring about it or not, we don't know, because US is also dependent on these states, including as it's dependent on Israel. Israel has its own interests. It wants weak Syria. It wants all weak Arab states. It wants weakened Hezbollah. And that is why you'd find Israel having different policies from US from time to time. But let's keep in mind one thing, that when we look at the opposition to Assad, when it began, I mean, a lot of it was also peaceful. So the problem therefore lies with both with the regime and the opponents, where both the regime and the backers of the opponents, they encouraged violence, and very soon, within a couple of months, what we found was the real moderate voice, those who want proper democracy in Syria, they were all sidelined, and it became a fight between two different kinds of violence. That's pro-state violence and the anti-state violence. But today, when we talk of moderate, extremist, it's very fluid, these categories, because who's moderate, who's extremist? How do we know that one day I'm moderate and I can't turn into extremist the next day?
It's what I would describe as a chaos of terminology, isn't it?
It is chaos of terminology, it's chaos of situation on the ground, but sadly the worst victims are not the West, the worst victims are all Syrians themselves. Syrians, be it Sunnis, be it Shias, be it Christians, Alawis, because they are the ones who have been displaced, they are the ones who have been victims of all kinds of terror, and they are the ones whose country is being destroyed.
I mean, sectarian violence does, to a great extent, harm, of course, US policy in the Middle East to an extent, but it aids it in another sense. But moving on, as a sign of its increasing involvement in the Syria conflict, Israel has taken a more aggressive military stance to events occurring near its borders. But as opposed to striking the Al-Qaeda branch, Al-Nusra Front, which controls the border area with Syria, Israel has repeatedly attacked Syrian bases and forces operating in the area. The latest attack took this interventionist policy one step further, as a group of Hezbollah commandos were killed by an Israeli airstrike in Al-Quneitra province in Syria. One of the fallen was Jihad Mughniya, son of Imad Mughniya, who was a senior Hezbollah commander, also killed in Syria in 2008 in what was believed to be an Israeli assassination. In response, Hezbollah attacked a convoy of Israeli armor in the occupied Sheba farms, with reports of IDF casualties ranging from 2 to 15 killed. As peace between Lebanon and Israel stands on a knife edge, we assess how important these developments are for the region and the current ongoing war in Syria. Now let's have a Syrian perspective on the matter. Mimi Laham, Syrian political analyst, joining us from Australia. Mimi,
Hi, Danny, thanks for having me.
you have been very active in documenting events in the region. After Hezbollah responded to the Israeli strike so dramatically, how close is Lebanon now to a new war?
I don't think they're close at all. You know, Israel has shown that it's backing down. They recognize that that Hezbollah is actually ready for an all-out war, and they really don't want a repeat of 2006, especially since Iran, one of the people killed in the Israeli strike was an Iranian general, and Iran seems to be backing Hezbollah in this operation, so they know that they would be facing Iran as well behind the scenes. They're basically content now to watch, Arabs and Muslims from all over the world and within Syria just destroy Syria, which is the greatest threat to them. So why would they risk tipping the scale and making themselves a target? I think they would much rather continue to just back terrorists rather than put their own soldiers in danger.
Mimi, Israel has also targeted Syrian bases on numerous occasions, yet the response from Damascus has been muted. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, there's been very small retaliations from Syria firing at Israeli patrols in the Golan Heights, but largely there hasn't been much of retaliation, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Syria is currently fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS on multiple fronts, and engaging in Israel would be an overstretch. Whereas, for Hezbollah, South Lebanon remains a safe position. Damascus has more risk in terms of visible targets on the ground. Hezbollah doesn't have this problem because they're a militia and, they don't have actual bases. Israel also doesn't want to risk targeting Lebanon and alienating its allies in the March 14th movement. So, from the rest of the population.
So, Mimi, would you argue that the Iranian alliance with Hezbollah and the regional kind of geopolitical hall of mirrors which is present is actually something which would act as a barrier against further Israeli intervention against Hezbollah?
Against Hezbollah, and Nasrallah actually made a statement saying any further attacks against Syria, Hezbollah would act on that also, and he's usually a man of his word. I think, partly Damascus hasn't been able to retaliate against Israel, perhaps because it's not getting the backing from Russia for such an operation, and of course they supply, the weapons. I think that, however, they're being overly cautious, and if they played brinkmanship as well as Hezbollah and Iran are playing brinkmanship, then I believe that Israel would back down in the same way.
Now, Dr. Anand, if we put events into perspective with the Israeli elections and Netanyahu's current political position, we augment this with Hezbollah's presence in Syria, and we could argue, what does each side have to gain from a military confrontation in Syria or Lebanon, i.e. the Hezbollah or Israel? What do they have to gain militarily from this?
See, when we look
at
Israel, sorry.
Dr. Anand.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry.
In fact, I'd agree with your previous speaker, but also slightly disagree. I mean,
Okay.
disagree in the sense that I don't think Syrian regime or Syrian government is in a position to play that brinkmanship vis-a-vis Israel, because it is fighting an existential battle vis-a-vis opponents within its own territory. So I do think that Syrian government is quite weak in terms of fighting a war with another country, though it's strong enough or resilient enough to survive. But it has survived mainly because of Iranian support, Russian support, but also Hezbollah support, and of course support from some section of its own population.
Precisely.
Assad. Now, when we look at Hezbollah, there's a difference between what Hezbollah wants in Syria and what Israel wants. Israel wants a weak Syria, which it gets. Therefore, it goes and attacks from time to time. It would want certain kind of conflict to be there forever, because that would strengthen its own position, and it would keep the Arabs divided. Right? Now, Hezbollah is there because it fights an existential battle like the regime. Because when we look at ISIS or others, people say, oh, one should negotiate with ISIS. I mean, who do you negotiate with in ISIS? Who is the ISIS? And given that the deep sectarian ideology that they have, they would not recognize anyone who's not of certain kind of Sunni background as human beings, as Muslims. So in this context, for Hezbollah, the fight and for Iran also, the fight in Syria was one of survival of Shiites and their allies. But for Israel, it's more about real politics. So given the elections in Israel, we should be surprised if it actually goes into something in a war situation, because they're not in a position to have war. But Israel remains very strong, but it would also want to keep Hezbollah preoccupied and divided. So Hezbollah would have to focus a bit on Israel, but also focus on Syria.
Dr. Anand, there is this kind of this element of acting too strong and acting too forcefully and too robustly, and in essence creating a situation, the chain of unintended consequences, if you would like, because Hezbollah did actually initially emerge because of Israeli policy towards Lebanon and the region. So would Israel, by its continuous attacks on Syria and its continuous aggressive stance towards Hezbollah, be fomenting more popular hatred of themselves through these actions?
Now, when we look at, let's say, the Arab world in general today, or even, let's say, the wider Muslim world, right? I mean, you could see, I've noticed that much of the hatred is no longer against Israel, despite what Israel has done. It is largely between Shia and Sunni. So, all different actors, including Israel, of course, but not only Israel, Saudis and Iran and others, they've managed to create a deep sectarian divide in the world where Israel goes scot-free. Now, of course, you are right. Israel has managed in 2006, for instance, to strengthen Hezbollah indirectly. At the same time, given the kind of battle Hezbollah has to fight in Syria, it cannot afford to have full-fledged war with Israel. But Israel also would not want full-fledged war, because it would not want to make Hezbollah into a martyr. So what it would want is create tension from time to time, which it did recently, right? Kill people here and there, but then not go into full-fledged war, because that would not suit the Israeli interest. But at this position, at this point in time, I don't think even Hezbollah is in a strong position to go for a full-fledged war.
Mimi, same question to you. What does each side have to gain in Syria, in your opinion?
I basically agree with your guest's answer to that question. It's a lose-lose situation for both sides. They both aren't in a position to have an all-out war. The same for Israel. I stated the reasons. They would much rather have, as your guest said, the tension between different sects in Syria, in the Middle East, fighting each other, than be a target themselves. And in Netanyahu's situation, just for his election, actually, no matter what he does now, it's going to be a lose-lose situation. So whether he retaliates or whether he doesn't start a war, he's going to be seen as weak or putting his country at risk. So it's a lose-lose. There's one thing I do want to mention, though, on brinkmanship. I think perhaps in Syria's case, the time for that would have been before, in 2011, before things got really heated up in the civil war, because it would have been in a much stronger position. And anyone who has followed the geopolitical situation would also know that Israel and the United States and NATO were the main backers of the rebel movement.
Okay.
So practicing brinkmanship there would have been good.
Now, Al-Nusra Front, which is Syria's Al-Qaeda branch, has been recently making significant advances in Idlib province against Al-Hazm movement, which is the US's favorite and most backed ally in Syria. The US have touted Al-Hazm group as the future national army of Syria and have been sending them sophisticated Tau anti-tank missiles, some of which have ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This comes as some rebel groups are fighting both the hardline Islamists and the Syrian army on many fronts. But the US-backed groups, described as moderate, have also been fighting alongside Al-Qaeda, as they attacked and captured Brigade 82 from the Syrian army after intense clashes. This is an example of these anointed moderate groups working with hardline Salafi militants such as Ahrar al-Sham in a wide-scale joint cooperation. The plethora of rebel groups present in Syria are now dominated by jihadists. Many of the initial rebels have defected to the radicals, giving Washington and its allies a fundamental problem to address. Yet in some cases, joint military operations are conducted against Syrian forces by the few remaining US-backed moderate rebels, the hardcore jihadists and the Al-Qaeda front, the Al-Qaeda branch, Al-Nusra Front. Now, if we could just take this to Mimi. Mimi, all across Syria, militant infighting is evident. But why do they fight each other in Idlib and join forces in Daraa against the Syrian army?
I think it comes down to individual warlords or rebel leaders. In those regions, maybe there's some power plays, maybe it has to do with money. So in some regions, some of the warlords would agree with each other, and in others, they might have a conflict over control. So on the other hand, it could also be because of the Qatar-Saudi split, Qatar backing some groups and Saudi backing others. But with Hazm Brigade, many of them have actually defected to Jabhat al-Nusra. They fought alongside Jabhat al-Nusra more recently in Aleppo, and in some other places they might have altercations with Jabhat al-Nusra, but those altercations usually end with surrender and handing over their Tau missiles that the US gave.
Mimi, the concept of moderate rebels in Syria, is this concept valid as we speak today after the rise of ISIS and the emergence of Al-Nusra Front? Or is this just an idea, a fantasy made up to support the rebels in Syria?
Well, Obama used the word fantasy when he described a ready moderate force in Syria. He basically said it doesn't exist. And I'd like to question the terminology moderate. What does that mean? Is it relative to Al-Qaeda? Moderate rebels, we've seen them eating hearts and beheading people and torturing prisoners. So what is moderate in those terms? It's really ridiculous. They are all some form of takfiri extremist theocrats with links to the Muslim Brotherhood, whether that be from ISIS or to the Hazm Brigade that the US is supporting.
Dr. Anand, similar sort of question. You have these groups in Syria who are allied to the West, and they state that they're against ISIS and the extremist jihadists, yet at the same time they work in tandem and in cooperation with Al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda branch and ISIS and the hardcore Salafi groups such as Ahrar al-Sham. They work together and coordinate their attacks on Syrian army positions, Kurdish positions, and yet the US still claims that there's a more moderate element within the Syrian opposition. This incoherence in what's occurring on the ground and how the US is perceiving it, is it the real reason why the US's policy in Syria is failing?
As I said earlier, I don't think US policy in Syria is failing. In fact, possibly this might have been the policy which is to weaken Syria, not destroy it. And in this case, they are succeeding in that. See, I think a good example to look at is Afghanistan, what happened in Afghanistan since 1979. And one would shudder to think that that's possibly the future of Syria if that's the direction it would follow, which is you have got 20 to 50 to 100 different kinds of groups, some called moderate, some called extremist, each fighting with each other and sometimes fighting along with each other. So you'd never know who's fighting for whom and who's backing them. And that's what's happening in Syria today. Now,
could we argue that there is a sense of hypocrisy, because we have this concept of the recent tragic Charlie Hebdo attacks, where these individuals, they're very well trained, they're extremists, terrorists, and they're described as terrorists in the media. Yet the fighters in Syria who perpetuate violent extremism on a much larger and wider scale, they're described as moderate. So is there a hypocrisy in the use of terminology which almost justifies a level of terrorism within the Arab world and strongly condemns terrorism in Western countries?
Sorry, did you ask me?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, in fact, of course, there's hypocrisy. I mean, if one word can be used to describe Western policy, or for that matter, policy of all the states, it's hypocrisy. Now, in this context, the terminology is important. But see, US also faces a crisis that it cannot accept that all the rebels it was backing, either they have been finished off, killed possibly, defeated, or have lost interest, and others have joined the ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now, even remember, 1 year ago, there was a whole discussion about fight between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and we now find out that, of course, there might be some petty battles here and there, but more or less they agree. They agree because they have certain common goal. But I would distinguish between, I would distinguish between those Syrians who took up arms to fight the regime because they believed, rightly or wrongly, that the regime was authoritarian, and those whose goal is not only to remove the regime in Syria, but transform the entire region. And that would be the difference between what I would say the so-called international jihadists, I say always so-called, but so international jihadists, and those who thought that they're fighting for freedom. The tragedy of Syria has been, and in this case, I would make it very clear, the responsibility is of international actors, but also a failure of the regime. The regime should have been better at handling it in the first instance, creating some kind of democratic reforms so that the moderate people who wanted some change in regime would have been accommodating. Now we are in a situation where Syria is in crisis. I don't know the exact numbers, but significant proportion of population has been displaced. And when you look at those images, and it includes victims, Sunnis, Shias, and all others, it is a horrible situation for which regime is responsible, but also the opponents.
Okay. Mimi, I would like to ask you a question on the issue of ideology. I mean, you have different factions in Syria. They're all different names of groups and militants and brigades. I mean, is extremism as a political ideology, Islamism, if we could say it, is it the same internationally, globally? I mean, is terrorism, in the way we saw it on the streets of Paris, the same terrorism that happens in Syria? Or is terrorism in Syria more justified than terrorism in European countries? What's your take on it?
It's absolutely the same. You know, they're using bombs to terrorize civilian population to further a political goal. That is the definition of terrorism, whether it be, you know, Islamic terrorism or state terrorism. But I'd like to speak to the idea that, you know, there's separate ideologies within the jihadists inside Syria, whether they be the Syrians that took up arms to remove the regime, or the ones who want international
Thank you very much, Mimi.
change.
Mimi Laham, a Syrian political analyst joining us from Australia. Thank you so much. Now, Syrian officials and opposition figures have been holding talks in Moscow in order to find the consensus with which to push forward a political solution. Talks had previously been on hold after Geneva II, which signified a fruitless attempt at dialogue and negotiations. But under Russian supervision, a new attempt is being made to ignite a diplomatic settlement for the crisis. To discuss this further, let me introduce Ali Ibrahim, a Syrian journalist and war correspondent joining us from Damascus. Ali, you have been in Syria for the duration of the conflict. Is there really hope for peace during the Moscow talks which are occurring now?
Well, actually, there is hope, though this hope is a very little hope. Regarding the Moscow talks or the Moscow meetings or the Moscow gathering, it seems that everyone at first had high expectations and then everyone had low expectations from the meeting. But this is, in a way, has paved the way for future steps, because this is the first time where we see the Syrian government sitting in one room with the Syrian internal opposition, which is the opposition that did not leave Syria and stayed inside the country. However, we should always remember that though we would like to remain hopeful, we should remember that the Syrian issue is not only a Syrian issue, it's actually a regional and international conflict also. Today, the fighting on the ground, which results in violence, and this is the violence that's causing the humanitarian tragedy in Syria. This violence is caused by the involvement of many international parties in the conflict. There are estimates that would go as saying that almost 15% of the rebels' fighting force are foreigners. There are other estimates that would say that 8% of the rebels' funding is external funding that comes from states or countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey.
So Ala, we could possibly argue that the Syrian state will not make concessions to the external opposition and vice versa. So Ala, in your opinion, what is the pathway to peace in Syria as you see it now?
Well, I think the concessions is not the right word here. I think everyone needs to reach a settlement. Even the external opposition, and we're speaking here about the coalition of opposition powers, have voiced very, very high demands from the Syrian government, demands that the Syrian government is incapable of meeting. Everyone knows that when they ask the Syrian president to step down right now, that this is something that could cause the Syrian state as we know it to falter, because many of the Syrian institutions are linked to the character and to the president himself. So in a way, this is unrealistic. So I don't think the Syrian government is capable of making such concessions, if this is what you mean by concessions.
Ala, stay with us for a moment whilst we ask a different question. Dr. Anand, there needs to be a global consensus for a successful solution in Syria. This is very clear. It's crystal clear. But is it possible to actually reconcile such powers like Iran and Saudi Arabia in a given solution for Syria? I mean, is it possible to have Russia and America sit down on one table with Saudi Arabia and Iran and all the influential powerhouses in Syria to find the global consensus for a solution in Syria?
I think when we look at the crisis in Syria, as your previous guest pointed out, there are different levels of crisis. There's one, the local one, within the country, largely, but then there's a regional one where you involve, let's say, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and others. Then there's a global one where you involve great powers such as US and Russia. I do think it's easiest for US and Russia to come to consensus over Russia in long term. It's more difficult, or rather most difficult, for Iran and Saudi Arabia to agree on something. So what we have is a situation where
Dr.
possibly...
Anand, would that be more based on a sectarian principle which is followed by both states, rather than a more geopolitical issue?
No, I don't think it's
Russia
sectarian, by the way.
America.
I think sectarian is a garb which both of them use, especially Saudi Arabia use. See, the biggest challenge that Saudi Arabia faces is from the model of Iran. Iran, with all its flaws, the Islamic democracy, they try to bring together Islam and democracy. Now, Saudis are the ones that promote certain kind of extremist ideology, and they argue that democracy is something completely alien to Islam, as if military alliance with the US is not un-Islamic, So the problem, therefore, is largely Saudi Arabia, flush with money, and its friends right now, including Turkey or Qatar. I mean, while they have the differences, they also have commonality. So I don't think that they are going to accept a solution where Assad remains in power and their proxies don't get a share. But still, I would also be hopeful, maybe because people are exhausted by the war, and so long as the regime makes some concessions and the opposition makes some concession, they should at least try to work together and maybe use US and Russia to resolve the conflict.
Thank you very much. Stay with us. Now, Ali Ibrahim, same question to you. Is it possible to reconcile Iran and Saudi Arabia to find a broad solution for the crisis in Syria?
Well, I think it goes far beyond Iran and Saudi Arabia. It is very complicated. Let's bear in mind that there are other regional powers in play here, not only Iran and Saudi Arabia. You have Qatar, which has a completely different agenda from Saudi Arabia. You have Turkey, which has also its own agenda in the Syrian conflict. And each of these parties have their affiliate rebel group that fights for their interests. And then we have the United States of America, which also are very directly involved in the Syrian conflict. And also we have Russia and Iran, who are directly supporting the Syrian government, and as a result, they are supporting one of the parties of the conflict. In conclusion, I don't think this is something that could be resolved in negotiations, just negotiations. I think there will be some kind of settlement, and this settlement needs to be first translated on the ground. Meaning, if the Syrian government makes gains that will make the rebels in a position that will force their supporters, or make it more suitable for their supporters to stop supporting them, because the rebels would be a liability in terms of financial liability, or costing too much money to their supporters, which is highly unlikely at this point, let me add, then yes, there could be a settlement. If Russia feels that the Syrian government is about to fall and the rebels are going to assume control of everything, then yes, Russia would be in a situation that it will be able to compromise and accept the conditions of the United States. But with the status quo we're seeing right now, with the Syrian government having the upper hand in most of the fighting fronts across the country, and with the current situation as radical organizations such as an ISIL and the Nusra Front sweeping other rebel factions and gaining control from them, then I think with the current situation, there is no possible way, starting from what we're seeing on the ground, where the United States and Russia would agree on a common solution for the Syrian conflict.
Ali Ibrahim, journalist and war correspondent, joining us from Damascus. Thank you very much for your participation. Now, Dr. Anand, last question. Is there an example or a framework which is present across the world, perhaps the Lebanese civil war, for example, which gives us a structure or a formation or a format of how we can solve the Syria crisis when taking into account empirical examples of other conflicts within the region?
I mean, look, each conflict has its own dynamics, and therefore we can't really learn from others. But you gave an example, let's say, of Lebanon in the region. What you have is sharing of power. That's very important. Now, one of the problems with Syrian government and system was the fact that it's one family or one person who is so overwhelmingly dominant. It does lead to a situation where you come up in authoritarianism, and then you want, even if those who support Assad, they may want more democracy, but they feel that he is important for secularism in the country, and that's the big crisis there. But the problem is how to resolve. I do feel strongly that a lot of Syrians possibly would be exhausted by the kind of war they have. Now, when we look at chemical weapon and the deal over that, we could see that Russia and US could agree vis-a-vis Syria and Iran. So US and Russia have the capacity to make them agree. The most important thing is to somehow remove foreign fighters from the place. And I say it's very important because in the end, the government will have to negotiate with Syrians who are fighting against it, and the fighters will have to negotiate with the government. There's no option apart from that. There has to be sharing of power. How that sharing of power will work out, we don't know. But the important thing is to recognize each other as legitimate and recognize that the biggest victim of the civil war are not Saudis, not Iranians, not Hezbollah. The biggest victims are all Syrians and the future of Syria. If they keep that in mind, hopefully it would work out. But right now, I think it's very important that they try to at least remove the regional powers and the foreign fighters that are there in Syria.
I mean, Dr. Anand, do you see the concept of prevailing secularism in Syria as an important feature to preserve over the future? I mean, Syria is one of the states which has advocated secularism as a core concept of its constitution and its being, if we could argue. So is preserving secularism in Syria amongst the most important things which should be taken into account in any solution?
Look, I mean, without secularism, there can be no Syria for simple reason. How do you manage a society and a country that has got different religious, different sectarian groups? The only way to do that is if you give everyone certain kind of dignity and equality. Now, it's only secularism that can offer an option where, regardless of what your religion is, what your faith is, you can get equality and dignity. As soon as you make your country, let's say, I don't know, Buddhist or Islamic or Hindu or Christian or whatever, you end up in a situation of Pakistan or of Israel, which is the country becomes one of the majority. And Syria has to avoid that majoritarian dominance. So there has to be sharing of power, but secularism is, in a sense, possibly the most important factor that can keep Syria united.
Okay. Dr. Dibesh Anand, Head of the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
For more updates, please visit levant.tv. Thanks for watching Syria Talks. Until next time.